Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in and welcome to this video, this next interview in the essay interview series. My name is Diego Fleitas. I'm a graduate student at the University of Mississippi and I'm very happy to have Professor Hilary Eklund with me. As a reminder, this interview series is meant to gather professors of all kinds of different backgrounds with all kinds of different research orientations to approach a very basic prompt. What are the ways in which we can better teach the early modern texts that we're so deeply engaged with? And I know as a beginning scholar, I'm very much fascinated and preoccupied and gratefully enlivened by the prospect of teaching these. So I'm very happy to welcome my guest. Professor Hilary Eklund is currently the Provost Distinguished Professor of English at Loyola University, New Orleans. She's the author of Literature and Moral Economy in the Early Modern Atlantic, Elegant Sufficiencies, editor of Groundwork, English, Renaissance Literature and Soil Science, and co-editor with Wendy Beth Hyman of Teaching Social Justice Through Shakespeare, Why Renaissance Literature Matters Now. Her current book project on a subject that is absolutely fascinating to me and which I'd love to hear about in due time examines the ecology of various wetland spaces and their relationships to such concepts as colonial incursion, resource manipulation, and more broadly, early modern human interventions. Welcome and thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is exciting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm also very compelled by the fact that the prompt that we give to all of the folks we interview is you're welcome to choose any early modern text that you would like to talk about, not limited to Shakespeare. And in fact, you actually chose a non-Shakespearean text, but one which maybe we could call Shakespeare adjacent due to the
Absolutely.
subject material, John Fletcher and Philip Massinger's The Sea Voyage. Very interesting play. I think in many regards very compelling. It displays kind of Fletcher's characteristic wit and quickness, and I think there's also a lot of physical humor involved in the play.
Sure.
First performed in 1622 at the Globe, it is a play that draws a lot of its material on Shakespeare's Tempest, actually. And among the many interlocking plot lines, there is a tempest to begin the play, the shipwreck of a group of French pirates onto a desolate island, upon which is Sebastian, a noble gentleman of Portugal, with his nephew, and the neighboring island where there are women, so styled as Amazons by the author, and there's love, there's betrayal, there's a lot of very unnerving suggestion of cannibalism.
Yep.
It's a very shocking and compelling play. So I think honestly, I'd love to open it up to you to ask is the basic question: what prompted you to choose the Sea Voyage for our time today?
Well, I think by now listeners or viewers will have kind of caught on to some of the things that make this place so exciting and so sensational. And I think it could be very appealing to undergraduates just for that kind of rollicking good time that it offers. And while I know that this is a series that's primarily about Shakespeare, I do usually try to include at least one play by a contemporary of Shakespeare in my courses. I think it helps to give students a broader sense of the world of early modern theater, and it often helps them understand, kind of through direct comparison, some of why Shakespeare's art tends to stand out and endure. From a literary history perspective, also, I think this play is extremely useful because of its, I mean, we might even say kind of aggressive replication of period tropes and structures, right? We've got islands, we've got every romance trope in the book, we've got colonial encounters, we have questions about material wealth and its uses, and so on. And the sea voyage is, I think, in particular, really teachable because of that sensational plot and the relative ease of reading, and the ways that it speaks to so many facets of the early modern period that we find critically pressing now. And for me, a person who thinks a lot about race, place, and the non-human, this play just offers like all of it, right? And in tons of interesting ways. So it is certainly, as you've already noted, a response to The Tempest, but it also extends that play's meditations in interesting ways. Meditations on islands as imaginative constructions, on coloniality and race making, economies of extraction and labor. So yeah, that's that's a little bit of why this play. I can think of some arguments why not too, but we're not here for that.
Absolutely. And I think you presented it very cogently because as someone who's also working on developing syllabi and starting to appreciate the professionalization aspect of being in a classroom with students, I feel like it is important to confront the kind of the platitude of Shakespeare being at the pinnacle of everything by putting him in comparison with others. I do think there is a very characteristic charm and rapidity to this text, which not only lends it to those kinds of great readings with any number of Shakespearean texts, not just The Tempest, but also appreciating the tropes. You're right. This play is a kind of cavalcade of so many of the commonplaces and the tropes. One of which, what stood out to me, is that love and pursuing people you love is like a hunt, like hunting for deer. So, absolutely, thank you. I think that's a very beautiful response. So, with respect to the fact that I have not brought the sea voyage into the classroom, and as I understand it, you haven't, kind of what approaches would you go with in terms of trying to engage students with the text?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I think a lot of the answer depends on what kind of course you're using it for. So you might take one approach in a Shakespeare class, making this text sort of part of a conversation with or a unit on The Tempest. I could also see it as being part of a literature and environment course, since it deals with uncultivated spaces, both utopian and dystopian, and some of those other things I've mentioned, like extractive economies and resources and labor. I might even consider putting the text in a Britlit survey, although, we tend to sort of focus on like greatest hits in those kinds of courses. And this, I'm not going to go as far as saying that this play is one of those, but it is such a cool distillation of other texts that are greatest hits, and you could build a little world around this play as an example of kind of reading and responding to the literary and cultural moment of the period.
I agree with you. And really, it is a text that's very amenable to a series of different approaches. You've definitely alluded to ecological approaches. Absolutely. I think it fits within a broader tradition of this sort of meditation on the utopian and the dystopian, especially as it relates to ecology. But also romance, and I think especially colonialism. Interestingly, this being a text, an English play that does not feature any English characters. It's between French and French pirates, really, and gentlemen and nobles, and the Portuguese, who are the ones that are marooned on these islands,
Yeah,
separated from one another.
yeah. And so there are all kinds of like ways that you could prepare students for approaching this text. I think some passing familiarity with the Tempest is essential. I think the plays are really closely enough linked that you know, for me anyway, it's impossible to talk about the Sea Voyage without also talking about the Tempest. But maybe just some key moments, like Miranda's witnessing of the shipwreck, and the nobles' debate about the qualities of the Isle, and then maybe the discussion of Caliban's alleged attempt to rape Miranda, Caliban's education. I think those are really key like set points for this play. And then in terms of historicizing the play for students, I would want to make sure that they had some grasp of colonial discourse, and in particular, the kind of moral justification of incursion into the uncultivated wastes of the world. And a text that I just think is incredibly useful and quick for doing this is the highly extractable Discourses of Western Planting by Richard Hakluyt. Um,
Hmm.
from I think 1596. It's easy to kind of mix that into a mini lecture or even a packet of like supplementary material. And then of course the students need to understand something about the genre of romance. But that context would really help to set up a discussion focusing on three things that I would like to focus on when I teach this, hopefully soon. which would be islands, the
Mhm.
making of colonial or the making of identity really in colonial spaces, and then questions of resources and their use.
Absolutely. And sort of building upon that last point of meditating on resources, not just natural resources, which food and hunger are absolutely just, they're themes that it's a through line through the entire play of the Sea Voyage.
Mhm.
We also see this being very inextricably wound up with gender and the
Yeah.
performance of gender. We do see a lot of the male characters who are sort of routinely and systematically sort of stripping the environment. They're unwilling to sort of cultivate it. Whereas just askance, just across the bay, you have this sort of this group of all of the Portuguese women who have not only cultivated a space, but they've also cultivated a sense of ostensible peace.
Yeah.
So
But each of those groups is faced with a really serious structural limitation, right? The men are there with all of the wealth that they were able to grab from their happy plantations that they were driven off from. Um, and so they have this mineral wealth that does them no good because they can't grow any food and there's nothing to trade, right? And then the women, although they have natural resources and food enough to survive, they can't reproduce. And so, this sort of becomes a structural problem that the play has to kind of bring the groups together in order to resolve.
absolutely. More broadly, this sort of theme of futurity, and we have the characters of Hippolyta and Crocale, who they're
Mhm.
having this conversation about an erotic dream, about running into a handsome young gentleman who's barely got the down of a beard on his face, and um, so it's also a play definitely sort of attempting to bridge or at least approach such weighty subjects as colonialism and these sort of ecological exploitations with the erotic as well. Um,
Yeah, the erotic, but I would also say the erotic is a way into the reproductive here, and which I think is really, really essential. As I read this play, I think it is gesturing in every way towards a plantation economy, where where the economic system relies on a kind of systematized reproduction of both the labor force to work in the fields, but also the force of managing labor.
no, most assuredly, couched amongst all of the romance tropes, there's definitely a biopolitical sort of imperative that's operating throughout this text.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
we've broached a lot of, I think, very pertinent and relevant subjects. Um, we've looked at this text as it sort of exists at the intersection of history and genre and all of these various major themes that we've touched upon. It is a play that is undergirded by all of these kinds of early modern brutalities, this sort of extractive mercantilism. Albert, one of the male protagonists, is a pirate.
Mhm.
Colonialism, as well as enslavement. So, how do you feel as though all of these things, and I know it's sort of a large ask, but how do you feel as though these various elements sort of converge? What tone does it produce in your reading of the Sea Voyage?
Um, this is a really big question, so I'm only going to scratch the surface of it, but I think we need to start by going back to romance. Because romance as a genre requires the resolution of the conflicts that it raises. And in this case, that's a resolution that has to do a number of things, including it has to neutralize the degeneracy of the island settings by binding the various things that make the islands respectively bad. Either one is uncultivatable, and then one breeds all this kind of uncivil behavior in these Amazon women. It needs to bind those behaviors to the island setting so that they can be left behind and sort of reconstitute a new society. Another thing that it has to do is restore the reproductive pairings that the storms and the shipwreck have torn asunder. And of course, we know that that's not going to happen with the meeting of the old generation. When Sebastian goes to the island, he sees Rosella and recognizes her as, like, I think the word is ruins. I think he calls her ruined. Um, so that is obviously not gesturing towards reproductive futurity, but there's a whole cast of kind of younger next generation folks who can pair up reproductively. And then third, the romance has to provide for the recuperation of the lost wealth, the
Mm.
lost plantation wealth in a different setting. And so, the whole cast kind of relocates at the end of the play. We don't know exactly whither to. I think it says something about to their several homes, but we know that where they came from before, what was their home before, was an island. So we could presume that this would be another, like yet another colonial space that they might be headed back towards. Um, so how does the romance achieve those ends through these islands with their distinct yet kind of wild ecological specificities? And how does that resolution speak to these broader considerations of colonial mastery in the early 1620s? So we've also got like this whole range of reference to consider, that from the Fortunate Isles to Jamestown to Bermuda to the Huguenot colony in Brazil, like all kinds of interesting potential reference. But for me, do you want to go ahead and jump in there?
No, no, I'm just so compelled. Please go on.
Um, so I think for me, the way that I read the play and the way that I would approach teaching it would be to engage students in a conversation about how um, uh, indigeneity is kind of erased from this play, and what does that mean? And how is it maybe redistributed? How are some of the tropes of indigenous, like savagery, redistributed among the European characters, and to what end? So being hungry turns men into brutes, while sexual starvation turns women into Amazons, right? Um, and then by writing those islands as kind of dispeopled of indigenous presence, and turning them into this kind of negative space, the romance then creates an opportunity to sort of bind those savage traits to that landscape and then kind of leave it altogether behind, abandoning it for happier islands of the future. So that's where I try to lead my students.
I'm stunned. I mean, that was so marvelously comprehensive. It wove together so many threads that by no means are disparate as the text presents them. You don't get these sort of larger, sort of thematic conversations on hunger without also talking about the ways in which the erotic and the sexual is also so deeply bound up with the colonial and the sort of propagation of that as a mercantilist structure. So, and I agree. I think there's a displacement on the elements of indigeneity and savagery that, say, The Tempest plays upon, or these contemporary travel accounts, that is then displaced onto the European characters.
Mhm.
I think the most egregious example of that is when they are actually going to assault and cannibalize Aminta, um,
Mhm.
female lead. And so it's stunning because upon being interrupted, the men who are going to cannibalize her, she excuses them. She says in Act 3, Scene 1, forgive them, 'twas their hungers. Could you maybe continue to comment on this theme of hunger in the Sea Voyage? And maybe it's a relation to your interests as a scholar. I know you've written on food.
Yeah, and I love that moment where she says, "Forgive them because it was their hunger," because I think it plays into this question of like, um, how to what extent can you blame people who are behaving badly because they're hungry? Um, Texts representing hunger in the period from like 206 to Coriolanus to like tracts about food scarcity, um, are are worrying with this question of like how people behave when they don't have enough to eat, and to what extent they could be held like morally responsible for that behavior. But I think hunger is a way into thinking about the hypermobility of categories, largely like it starts with um, sort of unsettling the categories of food and not food. In their hunger, the men start to eat the island itself. They talk about spoons full of mud as like these rich delicacies. Um, and as they do that, it starts to kind of infect them with more and more beastly appetites. So they fantasize about eating like medical waste. And then eventually, as you mentioned, when Aminta nods off to sleep, they start to talk about cannibalizing her. And super interestingly, the sort of cynical character Tybalt, when he comes in and hears his comrades talking about this, he's like, hang on, you don't want to eat her. You want to spare her to beget more food on. And so then, like, the taboo of cannibalism becomes like blown wide open. You're like, wait a second, like, what is the wrong thing here?
No, no, it was an absolutely jarring moment. It's unforgettable. I don't think anyone can genuinely encounter this text, be it through reading or, I mean, gosh, even through performance. I'm also trying to think about the ways in which this text would sort of occupy the stage space. But you can't really encounter it and be tepid. I don't
Yeah,
feel that that is a possibility.
yeah. And I think what's so interesting about that moment is that the taboo of cannibalism sort of gives way to a different taboo, which is a kind of like merely extractive economic system that doesn't provide for the future through some kind of recirculating or profit generating enterprise. And so the solution to beget more food on a minta is consistent with the play's kind of tilting towards a plantation economy rather than a mineral economy.
Yeah, unironically, it is Tybalt's modest proposal.
Exactly.
Just this jarring moment.
But he has other kind of cool comments too, like when the gentleman Franville, who's a bit of a dandy, is kind of lamenting having lost all of his fancy suits in the shipwreck. Tybalt comes in and talks about like he kind of paints this wonderful cartoonish picture of a dogfish in doublets or a haddock with a hatchet sword. And it seems really interesting to me that this is a leveling trope that we can trace back to like Hamlet or Lear. And the idea that the unaccommodated man is really hard to tell from a beast, right? And worms are coming for everybody. Okay, so far so good. But Tybalt takes it one step further when he imagines that instead of conferring social distinction on their human wearer, Franville's fancy clothes are going to comically reappear in on animals, and so it's also about kind of disturbing the category of the human and the animal, and uh, embracing maybe a way to think about inhabiting these terraqueous spaces too, and thinking about them as it's a way of rendering them less strange in a way.
Certainly, it renders a court under the sea. One wonders if they would have the same posturing as these courtiers like Franville.
Yeah.
Um, Absolutely. Well, I wanted to go ahead and transition to a question that I think is very much at the heart of your research interests, and we've definitely touched upon it. And it's about the two islands, specifically thinking through the ecology of the two islands. So, the island where initially the men are residing is described as cold, inhospitable, lacking in animals, and sparse in drinkable water. This is perhaps best epitomized by when Sebastian comments in Act 1, Scene 2, nature that made those remedies dares not come here, nor look on our distresses, for fear she turn wild, like the place and barren. The commonplace of, or rather, the commonwealth of the Portuguese women has stags, it has a boar, medicinal herbs, and abundant fresh water to supply them. So, given these kind of mirrored reflections across the bay of, on the one hand, ecological sparsity, and on the other, ecological plenty, which elements of this structural parallelism most interest you?
Well, it has to be the wetlands. And really interestingly, both of these islands are encoded as swampy in certain ways. And so we have one that is just swampy in like the worst imaginable kind of stereotypical ways. And then so we have a slow moving river that divides them, which is sometimes called Stygian or Hellish. Sometimes it's even called like a lake. And then each island has its own kind of muddy spaces. The island where the women are has this black lake that interestingly, um, when I think it's Kokali who's describing the hunt and talks about how the stag went to the black lake, but it was such a terrible place to take refuge that it would rather die than hang out there. And so it kept running, and that's how they were able to get it eventually. Um, so I'm really interested in the ways that those wet spaces that breed a kind of you know uh, revulsion among the characters are also encoded as dark or black spaces, and I'm reading those according to like what Kim Hall describes as tropes of blackness. And so there is not a single character in this play who is not white and European. There is not a single indigenous character. There was a group of indigenous people that briefly interacted with the women and then somehow conveniently disappeared. Um, and there's not a single character that is encoded as racially other to these Europeans. But I think, Ian Smith reminds us that that shouldn't be the only thing that we look for when we're looking for ways of reading blackness in these texts. So I think that these wetlands between the mud, the foul standing waters, the turbid streams, the black lake, um, chart a kind of wet landscape that plays into stereotypes of wetlands as savage wastes that are unfit for habitation and cultivation, but also the kind of potentially degenerating influences on their inhabitants. And we get maybe even the kind of latent threat of some kind of misogyny there. And through figuring those wet spaces as dark or even black, the play kind of activates those tropes of blackness to develop what is, I think, a racialized ecology that threatens the bodily like integrity of the inhabitants of those islands. Again, kind of contributing to that structural problem that the romance, I think, will try to solve by gesturing towards plantation at the end.
No, I absolutely agree with your reading of this racialized ecology taking place and the various ways throughout our conversation in which sort of reproductive futurity is continually being advanced, and the ways in which this not only is predicated upon an erasure of indigeneity um, and these sort of ecological extractions, but also the future of what comes next. Where does the next wealth generating project come from?
Yeah.
Um,
And if I
also,
might, I just want to circle back to teaching for 1 second, because I think um, it would be really interesting. A very familiar exercise I think a lot of us have used at one time or another is to have students draw a map of the island of the Tempest, right? But I think that map would be even more useful in this play. First of all, because it's confusing. The geography of it is just really confusing, but also it sort of forces students to visualize what are the differences between these spaces, what are the similarities, and then how can they represent the way that these spaces are kind of coded and colored and inflected with different sorts of moral investments in the play. And I think getting them to start there would open up a lot of these conversations and kind of naturally lead students towards some readings that will bring together the kind of colonial ecological readings that I'm proposing.
absolutely, it sort of puts them into the position of being stage designers, of really almost thinking about, yeah, how do you imagine these characters as they occupy space?
Mhm.
As they genuinely would have been as various actors and readers. Um, wow, goodness, I'm absolutely compelled by this conversation. Uh, but alas, to all things good must come an end. But I wanted to open up any space for you in case you had anything you wanted to ask or share.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to know were you reading this play for the first time in prep for the art conversation today? Yeah,
I
I'm
was.
just curious to know, did you see it as something that would be viable in your classroom, or did you feel like, you know, for whatever reason, it might not quite fit the bill?
That's a good question because I've been mulling over whether or not it would be good in a kind of gen ed course or maybe for a more specialist, kind of upper graduate level sort of seminar type class. I do find the text extremely amenable to a whole host of readings, as our conversation has, I hope, indicated to others, very much relevant. I do think I would be interested in bringing this text in the classroom, not just because it really forces us to grapple with a lot of, I think, intense and meaningful things to talk through, to discuss that are pertinent to our own world, but also it displays that kind of characteristic quickness of Fletcher. Really, with the character of Tybalt, as much as he's sort of characterized by that disturbing assertion of which he says about Aminta and having children, he's also this very quick-tongued character. Sort of, I see him as a bit of an authorial insert, and so um, there's maybe some value in sitting with this play and thinking through how is it that you can have such humor coexisting with such intense, I think, tragedy and also savagery.
Exactly. Yeah. Those contradictions, I think, are something that um, really lend it to conversations with undergraduates. So I'm looking forward to experimenting with it.
All right. Well, then in that case, we both have a lot of exciting things in front of us. I'd like to thank you so much for your time here today, and thank you everyone for tuning in and for watching, and I hope you'll join us for the next interview.
Thank you,
All right.
Diego. It's been a
Bye.
pleasure.